licensed civil and sanitary engineer in this state, and has as a civil engineer in California. He studied political science, civil engineering at Stanford and the University of California at Berkeley. He's a board-certified environmental engineer by the American Academy of Environmental Engineers and Scientists. He has almost 40 years of experience helping clients make difficult choices about capital investments in public infrastructure. He's served on the City of Bainbridge Island Utility Advisory Committee, and he's volunteered with the city's water quality and flow monitoring program. And he's been a friend and a member and a friend of Friends of Island Power Steering Committee for over 3 years, where he's led evaluations of Puget Sound Energy's record in carbon pollution, cost, and reliability. So come on up, Randall, and fill us in.
Thanks, Helen. Hello, everyone. Hello, Thurston County. I'll get right into the presentation. This is a quote from 1959. Edward Teller, remember the guy? It was the nuclear champion, saying to the American Petroleum Institute, carbon dioxide is a strange property, transmits visible light, absorbs infrared radiation, and the result of that is increasing temperatures in the globe and will eventually flood our coastal cities. So the American Petroleum Institute was told this in 1959. That didn't stop them from doing what they do, which is sell fossil fuels. And it hasn't stopped Puget Sound Energy from doing what they do, which is burn fossil fuels to produce our electricity. These slides come from earlier reports from the IPCC, basically highlighting what you've heard from previous speakers, that as we hurtle forward, increasing the consumption of carbon fuels and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the temperature of the climate is hurtling towards 4 degrees Celsius, which is about 7 degrees Fahrenheit. We've already reached 400 parts per million of concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. The slide in the lower right shows that it comes from ice samples that was measuring carbon dioxide concentrations in these ice columns. They have records from 800,000 years of ice samples, CO2 concentrations in ice cores. It hasn't been higher than 250 parts per million in 800,000 years. But the peak on the right is where we are now at 400 parts per million. This is another graph showing the projections. As you go, projections heading up to essentially 8 parts per million, at 850 parts per million. Basically the Paris climate change, the green one is the one in the middle, which is heading towards 600 parts per million. In order to keep it at 400 parts per million, we need to drastically reduce, not just drastically reduce what we're doing now, but actually the IPCC reports depend on our being able to take some of that carbon that's in the atmosphere now out and put it stabilize it. So we are in a serious climate crisis, and it calls for serious action. I'm here to talk about Puget Sound Energy and compare it to public power in the state of Washington. PSE was sold to Macquarie Capital Sydney, Australia back in 2008. They went from a publicly traded company to a private company, so that a lot of the financial data from PSE disappeared in 2009. But recently, you may have seen that in April of this year, Macquarie, at the end of their tenure, see these hedge funds, typically they have a 10-year period, they buy a company and then they want to sell it in 10 years and get out. So they went out, got out and sold to 3 Canadian and Dutch investment funds. I'll show you them in a minute. They're not guaranteed 10% return on investment, but they're allowed a 10% return on investment by the UTC here in Washington State. I'll show you that they're the largest carbon polluter of all utilities in Washington by a massive amount. The president of the CEO, PSE CEO, is the chairperson of the American Gas Association. PSE is the largest utility in the state with over 1 million customers. But in spite of the fact that we expect some economy of scale, their rate structure is almost the highest in the state of Washington among all 65 utilities. And the reliability is poor, especially where I come from, in Kitsap County. This is PSE's current owners. These are 5, they're now owned by 5, essentially pension funds, and there's a Dutch co-op that invests for pensions in Holland. Why are they interested in PSE? They're interested because that 10% return on investment is a pretty good return. I didn't get that in my investments last year. The Dutch firm, several of the 3 new purchasers were impressed by PSE's claim that they were going to reduce their carbon footprint by 50% by 2040. I'll show you that I don't feel so warm and fuzzy about that, about the facts of that. This is what you'll find if you try and find out who owns PSE on their website. They've somehow taken that off their website. Contrast to public power utilities, there are 62 of them in the state of Washington. Most of them set up in the 20s, in the 30s through the 50s. They're characterized by public management and ownership. They're PUDs, public utility districts, municipal utilities, and co-ops. And Steve will talk more about this breakdown in his talk. They are over 60% of Washington's electricity load. Their rates and bills are 25% less than PSE's on average. And BPA supplied public utilities average 15 times less carbon production per customer than PSE, and I'll show you a further slide on that.
That slide's a little inaccurate in that Whatcom County also provides electricity, but just to a refinery.
Well, why don't we talk about that in the question and answer. The website this is the website for Jefferson County PUD. We have Barney Burke, who's a previous commissioner at the PUD. They recently went from being a PSE county to a public power PUD, and they are now 98% carbon free and proud of it. The fuel mix, as is mentioned by Bortai, fuel mix at PSE is 59% carbon-based, about 35% is from Colstrip, Montana. There were 25% from natural gas or methane burning. There was this significant 30% hydropower in PSE's fuel mix. Jefferson County's fuel mix is 85% hydro. I've got around 10% nuclear and total 98% fossil fuel free. The fuel mix for Tacoma Power and Light, similar picture, 59% for PSE, Tacoma 2% fossil fuel powered. It's just the comparison of the power production and the carbon pollution of the various utility sectors in the state of Washington. There are 3 investor-owned utilities, PSE, Avista, and Pacific Core. PSE produces about 25% of the power. The other two for-profits, 12%. The publics produce 60% of the power in the state of Washington, so it's often not understood that the majority of the power in the state of Washington is delivered by public power utilities. In terms of carbon pollution, PSE produces almost 60% of the pollution. The other for-profits, 25%, so it's about 75% of the pollution is produced by the for-profit utilities. There are 2 or 3 public utilities that have carbon-based generation, but as you'll see in a minute, the majority of them are relatively carbon-free. So this is a plot I took from the State Department of Commerce, publishes every year a summary of the fuel mix, and from that fuel mix I calculated the carbon pollution from each of the 65 utilities in the state of Washington. PSE produces about 12 million tons of carbon, and this was from 2016. That is massively more than any of the other utilities in the state. The 3 for-profit utilities are the top 3 leaders in carbon pollution. The rest of the blue lines, the blue bars are the public power utilities. They almost disappear in this graph. Then if you do it per customer, how much pollution do these various utilities produce? PSE used to be the leader at about 9 tons per customer per year. They're now only second behind Pacific Core. But compared to BPA sourced utilities, it's about 0.6 tons because BPA does buy some power on the market that has carbon-based. So it's what it amounts to is that PSE, as a customer of PSE, you're producing 15 times more carbon pollution than you would if you were in a public utility. Just look at some of the trends in production. This is a trend of in fuel mix. PSE over the last 8 years has been in the range of 60% fossil fuel. The black line on the top is fossil fuel production. Their wind production has increased up to 9% in the most recent data, 2016, from the Department of Commerce. That's basically because they're required to do so by the Energy Independence Act. So they had to do that in order to meet the requirements of that act. So they have invested in wind farms to get to that 7%. On the right is the similar fuel mix plot for Tacoma Power and Light. It's close to 90% is hydropower. They've also got 7% of wind power in the last couple of years. So their wind power has gone up, but that's matching already a 90% production from hydro. So let's compare carbon pollution versus power demand as a trend. PSE's is on the left. PSE carbon production has actually gone up in the last 5 years. They were around 12 million tons back in the start of this period. They're back up there around that same level today. While their power demand's gone down. I mean, the scale numbers are a little bit deceiving. They've gone from 24,000 to 22 million kilowatt hours per year. But in any case, the trend has been carbon pollution's gone up while their power demand has gone down. For Tacoma, it's really a different story. The scale is much different because their carbon pollution is so much less. But in this case, both the carbon pollution and demand for power have gone down together. So this is I think a really interesting slide. To me, this is on the left is the cover of PSE's 2017 Integrated Resource Plan. The thing you notice is it's 3/4 full of windmills, and it's green. On the right is a figure from that report that shows what they actually are telling us they're going to do over the next 40 years, next 20 years. And the black line is the base projection, assuming that there's no carbon tax in the state. And we know PSC spent $145,000 to defeat 732. They didn't spend any money to defeat 1631 because Kaiser Aluminum spent $12 million. They didn't need to. And Koch brothers spent $1 million. Half a dozen petroleum operations spent $1 million each. So PSC's money wasn't needed for 1631. So they took no position. But you see that their main sales pitch, and the sales pitch was mentioned by these utilities, by these pension funds that bought them out, was that, well, we're reducing our carbon pollution by 50% by 2040. You notice the dip is right after 2035. They don't mention that by 2035 they'll still be at 12 million tons per year. They're projecting, they're telling us that they're going to be at the same level of carbon pollution that they are now in 2035. That in spite of IPCC reports and other information to the contrary, there's no urgency on the part of PSE to reduce their carbon pollution. And the reason it's dropping to 50% at 2040, of course, is because coal strip 3 and 4 is going to be 40 years old and it's going to go out of service. But they'll be replaced with methane plants. I think they've got 2,500 megawatts of methane plants planning to come online. If methane generation, if the carbon pollution for methane generation was accounted for the losses in the pumping and the transmission and the mining and the generation, if those losses were 3%, methane would be just as bad as coal. So these numbers assume the standard EPA emission factors, which assume that methane generation produces half the carbon pollution of coal. But in fact, you may have noticed the Trump administration does not want to. It wants to relax the requirements of generators and transmitters to talk about methane losses. When that's been measured, it's been anywhere from 3% to 15%. So methane is not the bridge fuel. Methane is a fuel that is as bad as coal if you include the life cycle impacts. This is just shows. I took it from the fuel mix data, or the fuel mix data from the Department of Commerce. They have 1 million customers. The next largest is Seattle City Light. It's about 500,000, but they have the largest single utility in the state of Washington in terms of customers and power. But it turns out they're one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, power rate schedules in the state. In December of 2016, I went to every website that I could find for every utility in the state. I found 49 of them, I think, and I plotted out at the average rate that we used in Bainbridge Island. It was a relatively high, 1,400 kilowatt hours per month. I plotted out what the rate schedules that were published on their websites would say how much that would cost per month. And it turned out that PSE's green power rate, which is a cent per kilowatt hour greater than the normal rate, would be the second highest rate in the state out of the 48. The regular rate is, I think, fourth highest. And, the red bars are the for-profit utilities. The blue bars are the public utilities. I mean, one thing that I noticed is that the two other investor-owned utilities have rates that are in the middle of the pack, whereas PSE's rates, even though they're the largest by a long shot of the utilities in the state, is up among the top half dozen of utilities in terms of cost. Where's the economy of scale? Last thing I want to talk about is reliability. This is some data on the left. Is from the American Public Power Association. For the Northwest region, the average frequency of outages for public power utilities, this is for the various regions across the United States. The one on the far right is the Northwest. It's close to the highest. It's 1.3 outages per customer per year was the average for the Northwest. Every county of PSE's service area in the 2016 reliability report that they published with the UTC, every county in PSE's service area was higher than the average reliability rating from the Northwest region for APPA. When you look at outage duration, it's basically a similar story. The average duration was, I can hardly read it. I imagine you can't either. It's about 130 minutes per year per customer. In Kitsap County, I mean, my house was out for 3 days 2 years ago. It's been better this year. I think partly because of our Island Power campaign, but who knows? If you compare kind of PSE's outage rates, this is the duration, to other utilities that are nearby to us. PSE's average duration outage for Kitsap County for the period from 2013 to 2016, it's about 1,000 minutes. PSE's average for Kitsap County, for their average for all of their counties was about 500 minutes. And you compare Snohomish County, 100 minutes, Orcas, 96, Penn Light, 89, Port Angeles, 40. These are for similar periods, 4 or 5 year periods. The reliability of PSE, in spite of being the biggest utility in the state, with the most customers and the highest rates, their reliability is poor compared to public power utilities. So, my conclusions: we have to stop carbon pollution from burning fossil fuels. PSE is the largest carbon polluting utility in the state of Washington, 15 times more carbon pollution per customer than Public's. PSE's planning, they've told us that they're going to pollute up to 2035 basically as much as they are now. And after 2035 they're going to pollute half as much, but if we account for the losses in transmission for methane, basically it's not going to change forever. And that's what they're telling us they're going to do. In spite of their green cover on their IRP, what they're telling us in that IRP that they're going to pollute beyond 2035. Their reliability is 4 to 14 times worse than comparable regional public utilities. Public power utilities have a better record than PSE on carbon impact, rates, and reliability. That's my pitch. I think we're going to hold questions to the end. So.
So our next speaker is Jim Lazar, who perhaps needs no introduction, but I will anyway. So as we know, he's an economist with a lot of experience, many years of experience in electric utility regulation, and he's appeared as an expert before the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. He says in many dockets addressing pricing, resource planning, and energy policy. He's written a handbook on electricity regulation in the U.S. and a lot of different papers. Some of them you can find on the internet. And I wanted to say another thing I found on the internet that I thought was worth mentioning. He is the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award. Oh, well, this is interesting, yeah. From the Public Counsel section of the Washington Attorney General for his decades of service as a consumer advocate. So we'll add consumer advocate. And in 1993, he was recipient of the Headwaters Award of the Northwest Energy Coalition, for which he received a plaque and a vial of water from the headwaters of the Columbia. So thank you for being a Columbia keeper. So.
Thanks very much for inviting me here. And Randall did a fabulous job. In fact, you can make my job a lot easier. Last month, Karen Mesmer and I did a two-hour sessions on where does our energy come from and what can we do about it here at Thurston County. And if some of you were here for that, you're going to hear and see some redundant stuff, but I know most of you were not. You should keep an eye on the continuing education effort of the UU Church. They do a fabulous job. I am the author of Electricity Regulation in the U.S., a guide that's used as a textbook in now 23 different colleges and universities around the country. And also a bunch of other papers on electric rate design, on energy efficiency. And you should take a look at these on the table here during break, and all of them are available for download at raponline.org for nothing. So, I'm also a former Thurston PUD commissioner. Only for a short time. I filled in a gap in somebody's term. But it certainly gave me a great introduction and exposure to things from that side of the table. The presentation I put together, the first half of it, a fair amount of it is redundant to what you just heard, and I'm going to skip over that very quickly. There's 2 or 3 slides I'm going to stop on. And then, because I prepared this on cost, carbon, and control, and we've already really heard about cost and carbon. There's 1 or 2 slides in that area that I'm going to stop on. But what Randall's given you is an outstanding introduction to this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current use in Thurston County, our current energy supply in Thurston. I'm going to skip over the comparison of electric utilities and carbon because Randall's done that. This is the overall energy use map for Thurston County, with petroleum at the bottom, natural gas in yellow, coal in red, and the other electricity fuels up above the red line feeding into electricity generation. What we're talking about here is only something less than half of the energy use in the county. There is also carbon in our natural gas, and there is lots and lots of carbon in our transportation. We don't solve this whole problem just with the electric utility. We need to change how we heat our homes, how we heat our water, and how much we move around and how we do it. That map does not include things like air travel, the embodied energy and things that come here. This microphone was not manufactured in Thurston County, and energy went into it. Stuff that we consume when we're somewhere else is not in the Thurston energy map. And we have very little industry here. Almost all of our manufactured products come from somewhere else. As I said, I'm going to skip over a lot of this. PSE's major resources. 4 coal plants in Montana, and they buy power from the coal plant 22 miles from here down in Centralia. They have 3 wind farms, 5 natural gas-fired power stations, and some hydro. Most of their hydro is not produced by dams they own. They buy most of it from public power utilities. They do own a few relatively small dams. There's another picture of Colstrip. Randall, I thought, had a better one that gave a perspective on what they've done to the surrounding territory. I'm going to skip over all the carbon metric and rate stuff here. because Randall did a better job than I was going to do. PSC's profile in Thurston County has 120,000 electric customers, about 47,000 natural gas customers, 1,500 miles of overhead lines, 1,200 miles of underground lines, 182 miles of high voltage transmission, substations, transmission stations, and on the natural gas side, 863 miles of lines. I'm going to bring up the natural gas because when we get into alternatives, that becomes possibly important. Their future resources, Colstrip 1 and 2, Centralia 1 and 2 will be retired. They're planning to run Colstrip 3 and 4 until 2036. Randall brought up something on their integrated resource plan. I'm going to show just a couple of others. This is the solid bars are the resources that they have already in hand. And those go down over time as things retire. And as the hydro contracts with the Mid-Columbia utilities drop off. This is their projected need for energy. And that leaves a pretty big gap between what they've got and what they need. They're going to be buying a lot of resources. Their integrated resource plan plans to fill in the vast majority of that gap with purchases from other utilities backed up by natural gas generating plants that they plan to build. And their carbon emissions, the black here at the bottom is a coal. It drops way down when Centralia goes offline, it comes back up, and then when Colstrip 3 and 4 go offline, and then the coal drops to zero. But this gray bar here is natural gas and purchased power. And most of the purchased power comes from natural gas generation. So the carbon emissions aren't expected, as Randall said, to go down nearly as much. And there's very specific resource reasons why. The decline of their contracts in yellow, eventually the retirement of Colstrip, and it's going to run pretty hard between now and when it retires. Achieving an 80% carbon reduction by 2050, the foundation stone of the Kyoto Protocol, is I think, one rational standard to impose on every player in our energy future. The Sustainable Thurston Plan, adopted here locally, calls for a carbon neutral community by 2050. To achieve that, the 80% reduction, we would basically have to have electricity go to zero, natural gas go to zero, and petroleum use drop by 3/4. It's not an easy at all challenge to meet. PSE's electric system has no plan to achieve 80% reduction. And PSE's got somebody here who may be able to speak a little later about that if they're asked. The PSE gas system has essentially no plan to reduce carbon at all. So now I'm going to get into the alternatives. What can we do other than PSE? Continued service from PSE in various forms is one option. Forming municipal electric, or perhaps municipal electric and gas utilities, is another choice. Electric cooperatives are a choice that we could implement, and in some ways the easiest choice. Activating or adding electricity to the role of the Thurston County PUD is one. Possibly negotiating a community-wide agreement with PSE for direct service to this county with different resource mix than they use for their other counties. As they're acquiring resources to meet their needs, we could have them acquire clean resources to meet our needs. And the last is something that's working in California that'll talk about community choice aggregation. Randall talked about all the utilities. We had a better map than I do. The key reason why the public power utilities, municipals, PUDs, the Indian nations, and the electric cooperatives have so much lower carbon emissions that they have access to the BPA hydropower produced on federal Columbia River power system. That hydro system by law gives preference to public bodies and cooperatives. In the Northwest Power Act, which passed in 1980, sometimes known as the Jackson Bill, it was pitched as providing residential customers of investor-owned utilities equal access. That has not been achieved. PSE receives a financial exchange credit in lieu of getting the power from the hydro system. You can see it on your PSE bill every month. But it makes up less than 1/3 of the difference in power cost between PSE's power cost and the public power utilities power cost. And it's not a real power transaction, so there's no carbon savings, and PSC reports that accurately. There is a limited amount of additional power available from Bonneville for new public power utilities in each contract period. And Jefferson was PUD's formation, that you'll hear more about later, was able to take advantage of some of that. Public power rates are lower mostly because of access to BPA power and the fact that they're nonprofit. They don't pay any federal income tax. In the case of the municipal utilities, they have shared overheads. The city of Ellensburg has, a whole staff for other things, including roads, but they have an electric utility and a gas utility, and it shares management and equipment with their road department and their parks department. So that shared overhead is a significant savings for municipal utilities. It can add up to a huge difference. So the first alternative is continued service from PSE. PSE has what are called franchises with each of the communities it serves: Olympia, Lacey, Tumwater, Thurston County, Yelm, Rainier, Tenada, Dakota. Those franchises expire over time. They're typically 10 to 20, sometimes 30-year agreements. They mostly focus on coordination, make sure that road construction and electric construction is coordinated. They don't typically get very deep in. They could require undergrounding of lines to address the reliability deficiency that PSE has. They could possibly influence the power supply mix. It would take fairly aggressive interpretation of the role of a franchise to do that, but it might be possible to do that through the franchise process. Municipalization, creating a city utility, is a tremendous opportunity. Cities have statutory authority to provide electricity and natural gas service. They would be able to access the Bonneville system gradually. They probably wouldn't get all the power they need from Bonneville, and they wouldn't get it all at once, but over a 10 to 20-year period, they would be able to achieve an equal share to the other public power utilities. So our carbon impact wouldn't drop suddenly, it would drop gradually as we phased on to BPA power. They have the advantages of public power. They're nonprofit, they have no federal income tax, they can issue tax-exempt bonds. They would help to spread city utility costs. Our parks department would have more money. Our police department, fire department would have more money by sharing overheads with additional business operations in electricity or perhaps natural gas. One of the disadvantages, perhaps, is that the cities pay better than anybody else. And so there might be some increase in labor cost compared to what PSE spends for the contractors that it hires to maintain things. I did pull up the Olympia Power and Light logo. There actually have been 2 Olympia Power and Lights. The first was around 1900, was an electric utility that was privately owned. And this logo is actually from a newspaper that was published a decade ago, locally, called Olympia Power and Light. There are lots and lots and lots of public power utilities. Seattle, Tacoma. Ellensburg is a little unique because they're both gas and electric. And you get one bill for water, sewer, stormwater, solid waste, electricity, natural gas, and one envelope and a whole lot less paper and a whole lot less cost. And then some small ones, Richland, smaller than Olympia, Lacey County. Centralia, town of McCleary, 15 miles west of here, has an electric utility. City of Summits, 600 customers, operates an electric utility. Blaine, and Ian thought a little interesting, it has a municipal gas utility, but not a municipal electric utility. A little unusual. There's lots of them. If Summits and Blaine and McCleary can run an electric utility, it's obviously not that hard to do. Of all the utilities in the state and around the country, the municipals tend to have the lowest rates. First of all, they have very compact service territory, so they just have a cost advantage over the rural utilities that have, 2 to 10 customers per pole mile, whereas the municipal utilities can have 200 customers per pole mile. Because they provide other services, they spread their overheads out, combined billing, shared staff, one city council that handles not just, whereas the PUD commission only does the utilities, the electricity or water and other services they provide. Municipal city council oversees a whole range of stuff. So the municipal utilities have the lowest rates, the co-ops have actually the highest, and the private utilities are in between. That's not a criticism of the co-ops. They mostly serve very rural service territories, and it's difficult to provide service in many of those rural areas at all. The municipals tend to have the highest social conscience. Given where we're meeting, I thought this might be important to consider. In Seattle, low-income consumers get a 60% discount on their electric bills from the regular rates, 50% off water. Los Angeles, Austin, very similar, very large discounts for low-income customers. Municipal utilities tend to consider the utility a part of their entire sphere of activity and consider it as a tool in providing all of the services that are to provide. Co-ops and public utility districts tend to be very narrowly focused on utility service and not have anywhere near the same concern for low income or handicapped customers. It's just, they've got tunnel vision on running a utility, whereas the municipals tend to view it as one of many public services we provide, and our job is to provide service to the public in a broad sense. Now I'm going to move to co-ops. Electric co-ops can provide service in any area. They can access power from the Bonneville Power Administration, just like a municipal or PUD. They're member controlled. It's 1 vote per meter. So corporations get a vote in co-ops. They're people. Whereas in municipal and PUD elections, only voters get to vote.
They only get one vote though, just one.
They get one vote per meter. And they find it cheaper to take power through 1 meter, so they don't buy it. I suppose they could ask for 1,000 meters to get more votes. They don't do that. The co-ops have a very large national association, National Rural Electric Co-op Association, that provides a lot of technical services to them to enable pretty small utilities to do a pretty good job. There are a couple nearby here in western Washington, Parkland, Light Water up in Pierce County, Tanner Electric, serves a very oddball piece of King County. Most of the co-ops in our state are on the other side of the mountains. Work as Power and Light that serves the San Juans as a co-op. The co-ops serve 56% of the nation's landmass. So while they're only 10% of the customers, 10% of the power, they're over half of the landmass of the country. And that gives you an idea why their service may be more expensive. Co-ops are not all rural. The Pedernales Electric Cooperative, the largest co-op in the country, is based in Johnson City, Texas, not far from the Johnson Ranch, across the street from the Johnson School, down the block from the Johnson Pool. About half of their customers are in the suburbs of Austin, Texas. The Jackson Electric Member Cooperative in Georgia serves a large part of suburban Atlanta. The one that I think is most relevant for us to discuss today is Salem Electric. Inside the city limits of Salem, plus the town of Kaiser. The rates are 20% below Portland General Electric, the adjacent private utilities rates, also 20% below PSC's rates. And the reliability is second to none in the Northwest. I worked for them as a consultant for many years. It is an exquisitely managed utility. This is in service territory. There's downtown Salem, so it's West Salem and the town of Kaiser up here. Salem Electric was formed by originally by a guy who ran a radio station, who was tired of his power to his radio station going out from Portland General. And he got together with a buddy of his who was an electrical contractor, and another buddy of his who was a small forester. And he had access to one, so one had access to poles, one knew how to string wires, and this guy knew how to raise money and build a community. And they set up Salem Electric to initially compete with Portland General and eventually chase them out of their service territory. Washington law is pretty interesting. There is nothing that would stop Bortai and Helen from filing tomorrow to form the Bortai and Helen Electric Cooperative and go into the business of providing electric service in any place that they found customers wanted it. The cities would be required to give them a franchise on equal terms and conditions to PSC. They could, in theory, start business tomorrow, but you should best be prepared with several $1 million for lawyers because PSC will find things about your proposed business plan to challenge. But other than that, there's really no, other than lots of lawyers building lots of hours, there's no real legal obstacles. I'll now come to Thurston PUD, where I served as a commissioner in 2012. And Chris Stearns, a longtime member of the commission, is here and can probably answer questions during the break about Thurston PUD. Currently serves only water, and not all of their water customers are in Thurston County. There was a public petition and vote, and I see some of the folks that worked on that campaign here, to enable it by electric service. That vote failed by a 40% yes to 60% no margin. It was countywide. Another vote could be done by commissioner action. My own opinion is that the countywide PUD is probably not a good choice, and the experience in Jefferson reinforces that, because you take all the rural area that's expensive to serve, whereas a municipal or co-op utility could bite off the urban areas where the vote is more favorable. And we just passed in the urbanized area of Thurston County the transit tax with a 67+% vote. That's how our urban area votes. On the other hand, our county commissioner race is about 50-50. And,
I's gonna win.
and countywide the vote is a lot more conservative. So I think that focusing on the urban areas make more sense than the PUD. The study that we did in 2012 at the PUD looked at 3 different options. One of them was downtown Olympia, one was the Olympia Tumwater area that's shown here, and the third was serving the city of Yelm. It assumed we could get access to BPA. It concluded we would have lower rates over time and cleaner energy. But one does make to look at the Jefferson PUD takeover at PSC. Some things were done very right, some things in my opinion were done very wrong. I've been involved in the activation of 4 different public power utilities: Emerald PUD in Oregon, Oregon Trail Electric Cooperative, Hawaii Island Utility Cooperative, and another, there was one more in Oregon. They paid an extraordinary premium to acquire the system. That bought them cooperation from PSC. That was good, but the price was very, very high. Their overall rates are higher than PSC, but they will be lower than PSC's after they amortize the acquisition premium. Come back here in 15 more years and their rates will be significantly lower than PSC's. Their rate design is much worse than PSC's. That PUD departed from generally accepted cost allocation and rate-making principles that we have fought for 40 years at the Utilities and Transportation Commission to make sure you only pay to connect to the grid the costs of connecting to the grid. They adopted a rate design that includes a substantial part of the distribution system in the fixed charge, so they pay $18.50 a month to hook up in Jefferson versus $7.50 a month for PSC. Very sad, in my opinion. They should have taken PSC's rates and applied a uniform discount or premium to all of those rates. On the other hand, on solar, they're moving much faster than PSC and existing customer solar. So now I've been through municipals and co-ops and PUDs, and I'm about to the end here. One is to get PSC to commit to a cleaner power supply for Thurston County. PSC has offered many of their retail customers what they call their Green Direct program. Here's logos, City of Olympia, City of Lacey, I think City of Tumwater, Port of Seattle, City of Anacortes, Western Washington University, where I went to school, have all signed up for this Green Direct program where they're agreeing to buy power from a specific renewable energy development and have a long-term contract to pay prices based on the cost of that. Expect to save them money in the long run. PSC could offer that to Olympia on a community-wide basis, and the Olympia City Council could vote to accept that. It would be a new thing in Washington. Nobody's done it yet. It could be an issue in the franchise negotiation process to make that a condition of continued access to put their facilities over and under the city streets and rights of way, which PSC requires. So I don't write that off. And a variation on that theme is something that's going on a lot in California now, community choice aggregation, where Marin County, for example, has created a community choice aggregator that buys power on behalf of everybody in the community except for those who choose to make their own arrangements. You can't opt out. In this situation, the utility remains as the distribution network provider. They continue to be the people you pay your bill to. They continue to maintain the system, but the power supply is brought to them. And you'll see in a minute why this is, I think, realistic. They typically acquire a cleaner power supply, and often a cheaper power supply. And there's some not so good reasons for that, but that are coming up in California, but it's typically cleaner and cheaper. In Washington, it would probably, I think, require state legislation, and there's no certainty that it would be cheap. It might be a significant cost premium. But these little aggregators are, this one in Marin is proud to announce that light green costs 2 to 5% less than Civic gas and electric is, effective March 1, 2018. So they're delivering a cleaner product for less money. Now, I'm going to come back to this graphic. PSC needs a whole bunch of power. That's their projected load, and this is their projected resources. If the community choice aggregators could buy clean power for some of the communities and help fill in that gap, it would enable PSC to meet their system-wide need at lower carbon cost and give communities, perhaps like ours, the ability to control our own destiny. This is a big gap. Last point on this is that moving our power load off of PSC would actually in many ways benefit PSC and their other customers, and the folks in Bellevue and Bremerton and Bellingham. They have very high power needs. They have rising costs and rising rates. If they sold the Thurston system, or part of it, to the Olympia Municipal Utility, or to the Thurston PUD, or to the Port and Helen Electric Cooperative, that would bring a bunch of money back to them who bought off their system. When the Jefferson system was bought off, each of us in Thurston County, each PSC customer in Thurston County, got a $40 credit because the Utilities Commission thought that the profit that PSC made off of Jefferson County should be shared with us. Now, the reduced power need on the PSC system would slow the increase in costs to other parts of the PSC system. So we'd be better off. The rest of the PSC system would be better off. And yes, the existing public power utilities would have to share the low-cost Bonneville power with us, and over time they'd be a little bit worse off. But perhaps in a question session, we can talk about that impact. I don't think it's really, we should not view that as an obstacle, because those utilities with their very high hydropower capability have a tremendous ability to take wind and solar into their systems, because hydro is so flexible. So I put together a little table comparing the options in terms of access to BPA power, the cost to consumers, political feasibility, consumer control, tax-exempt finance, and access to clean energy. The municipal option scores pretty well on all of these. The co-op scores okay on all of these. PUD scores okay on all of these. Community choice aggregation has some question marks because I think it would require legislation, and they're running into some obstacles in California. And the state of PSC has the least access to clean power, the highest costs, and the lowest level of consumer control. And I look forward to your questions during the question period. And Ellen, let's move on.
Give me the restless power of the wind, the comforting glow of the wood fire, but take all that atomic